Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Maggie Epstein, and I'm the Marketing and Outreach Manager here at Primary Source. I'm very excited to welcome you today. But before we get started, let me tell you a little bit more about Primary Source. I want to first welcome those of you who are new to Primary Source and say hello again to those of you who have taken courses or webinars with us before. For those who don't already know, Primary Source educates K-12 teachers about world histories, cultures, and global issues. We provide graduate courses, workshops, and study tours that bring global perspectives to K-12 classrooms across the United States. Our programs give teachers background knowledge and teaching ideas on Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and the United States. And many of our courses help teachers make curricular connections across multiple borders and cultures. We have a 7,000-piece library here at our offices in Watertown, Massachusetts, and our online curriculum and resource guide collection is growing and expanding, it seems every day. Approximately 2,500 educators participate in our programs each year. This means that over 200,000 students benefit from our work annually. To learn more about us, I invite you to visit our website at www.primarysource.org. Okay. And before we get started today with the webinar, I want to remind everyone that a recording of this webinar will be made available to you. We usually get those out in about a week. We will also share a link to the PowerPoint presentation that you're seeing today that our scholar will share with you today. And throughout the webinar, I will be typing in web addresses into the chat box. So you should see those pop up on your control panel, and those allow you to click on any of the links that come up. You won't be able to click on the ones on the GoToWebinar viewer, but in the control panel you should see them there. If you have any problems or questions, of course, you can enter those into the questions box. And as we proceed through the webinar today, you can enter your questions at any time, and then my colleague Lena will be leading the Q&A period. So Lena is a program coordinator here at Primary Source. She's going to be introducing our guest scholar and, as I said, facilitating the Q&A session in just a little bit. So Lena, I'm going to unmute you, and you can go ahead and get us started.
Thank you, Maggie. And hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Sounds great.
Great, okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Lena Yamashita, and I'm very glad that all of you are joining us for a webinar today. As you may know, March 11th, 2012 marks the one-year anniversary of the devastating earthquake and tsunami that struck the Tohoku, or northeastern region of Japan, and triggered the world's worst nuclear accident since Chernobyl. The crisis has raised national concerns over nuclear power and its impacts on health and the environment, as well as skepticism about information from the government. At the same time, the disaster has inspired grassroots action and responses from the civil society. To help us understand how Japan, the only nation to have experienced atomic weaponry, developed one of the most advanced nuclear power programs in the world, and to recognize the ways in which public opinion on nuclear power has shifted since the disaster, we're pleased to have Professor Daniel Aldrich with us today to share his expertise. He's an associate professor of political science at Purdue University, and his research interests include post-disaster recovery and the interaction between civil society and the state, and he has published widely on issues around disaster recovery. He is also an expert on nuclear energy, Japanese civil society, and U.S.-Japan relations, and has made a few research trips to the areas affected from last year's earthquake and tsunami. In particular, Professor Aldrich has been conducting research on how Japanese people's attitudes toward nuclear power have shifted, and he'll be sharing his findings with us today. Professor Aldrich will speak for about 40 minutes, and after that we'll have time for Q&A. So please feel free to type your questions into the question box as he's speaking. So now, please join me in welcoming Professor Aldrich.
Thank you very much. It's a big honor to be here today. Some of my scholar colleagues in the academic field often write on subjects they've never experienced. So they write about the Congress having never been there. They write about the military having never served. I, for better or for worse, have been involved in nuclear power in Japan and been involved in disasters in America. In 2005, my family and I lived in New Orleans, Louisiana, and when we lived there, we had about 6 weeks before the storm came and destroyed our home, our house, And this project is, in part at least, a response to our personal experiences. As survivors of Katrina, I wanted to know around the world if survivors had similar experiences where communities came together to help them out. So today, hopefully, we'll have three major goals. We're going to look at how Japan, which, as Lena said, is the only country in the world to have experienced nuclear weaponry, could have developed one of the world's most advanced programs. We're going to talk about the ways in which public opinion has changed over time in Japan. And this is really critical because I think we're seeing now a new response to nuclear power since the accident. And then finally, I hope we'll talk about the different factors that will matter in the recovery process. That is, of all the things that can come in, money from the government or damage from the disaster and so forth, which of those factors will be the most important for these areas in Tohoku, in northeastern Japan, that have unfortunately lost 20,000 citizens so far, and literally billions of dollars in property, homes, houses, and lives. Let's begin by talking a little bit about Japan's nuclear power program. And the interesting question for me always is thinking about what was it that the Japanese government could do or could think about to push Japanese citizens to begin using nuclear power, especially given Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. If this slide will come up, there we go. This map shows the roughly 17 communities in Japan that have been host communities for nuclear power plants since the 1960s. By the way, if you notice on the right side of the map, you see Fukushima Daiichi. That's literally the first Fukushima reactor. That, of course, is the site of the meltdown. That's also the site where I spent over 2 weeks as a student studying not only the nuclear reactor, but also the interactions between the local civil society and the members of the plant, how the local community saw that reactor. And in fact, I spent time taking tours of the plant, of course, which is now in shambles, which was destroyed by a combination of the tsunami and the hydrogen gas explosions. But notice how these 17 or so communities are all on Japan's coasts. All of them are far from Tokyo, the capital of Japan. And all of them, as well, are immediately on the coast because nuclear power plants in Japan draw in cooling water from the ocean to reduce the amount of heat. Of course, they generate electricity, but they also need to cool the plants. So Japan, the engineers there have chosen for all the plants built since the 1950s to build them near the water. I think there's another reason, though, why the Japanese government and these electric utilities chose these communities as sites for nuclear reactors. And I argue in my first book that the government worked with these places like TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Company, to find communities where there'd be less resistance to these kind of programs. That is, where the citizens locally were less likely to fight back against the process of building a nuclear power plant. So these citizens in these areas of Fukushima Daiichi and elsewhere, the government surveyed them to see how well coordinated and mobilized they were and compared those numbers to communities nearby. So at the end of the day, the selection of these sites, I would argue, wasn't just about the technocratic criteria, geology or geography, but also about the likelihood that the plant would be finished because of the lack of resistance from communities nearby. Once the government worked with power utilities to choose these areas, they still wanted to bring local opinion in line with national goals. And this chart, which as you might notice is done in scientific notation because the number of zeros is so large I cannot fit them on the axis otherwise. This chart shows a fund called in Japanese the Dengen Sampo, which translated means roughly the 3 electricity production laws. Those laws, since 1974, have provided roughly $17 million US a year to each host community in Japan that has been willing to take on a nuclear power reactor. Many of the communities we just saw on the map are very small. They're depopulating, people are leaving the areas. And on top of that, they also have very few industries nearby beyond fishing and farming. So the amount of money provided by the government can be a tremendous economic incentive to these local facilities as a reason to bring them in. Now, the next slide is going to show some other policy tools used by the Japanese government in trying to bring local opinion in Japan in line with their overall energy goals. This first slide shows a group of Japanese local government officials and local residents visiting the San Jose City Hall. Kind of a strange picture, I suppose, for a government tool. But the government, since the 1960s, has often flown local citizens and government representatives to go meet with other communities that already have nuclear power plants in their backyards. So there are no nuclear power plants in San Jose. They're in fact much further away from San Jose. But the government allowed and paid for these citizens to travel to America and thousands of other citizens throughout Japan to visit existing nuclear power plants as one way of showing them it's possible to coexist with nuclear power in their own backyard. Psychologists might call this the habituation visit. And the idea is to show you that if someone like you, a student or a teacher or a gardener, can live in the shadow of nuclear power, so you can do as well. This next tool I'm calling the scientist visit. And oftentimes, a community in Japan that was a potential host for a nuclear power plant would receive a phone call from the central government asking them if they wanted a free visit from a scientist, an independent scientist. Now, in most of the cases, these scientists were in fact employees of the central government, and they would come in and lecture to local citizens, as you see here, about nuclear power. Now, here's what they would say, at least when I visited. They would say that nuclear power was safe and necessary, and beyond that, they would argue, if the town took on this reactor, it would be assisting Japan in meeting its national obligations toward the Kyoto Protocols. In other words, there's a sense of patriotism as well that was intermingled with the arguments that it would be safe for them and also economically beneficial to have these kinds of plants nearby. One more example of a somewhat unusual policy tool used by the central government to bring local opinion in line with national plans is a yearly fair held outside Tokyo in a place called Makuhari Messe, which is basically a large convention center near Yokohama. And if you can read Japanese, by the way, the very top flag in the center has two characters there that read To-Hoku. To or Higashi means east. Hoku means north or kita. So of course, this is a flag from the area that's been damaged. This picture was taken before the disaster occurred. But the only flags that you see in this picture and the only vendors allowed to sell their goods at this convention center are vendors who live in host communities. That is, fisher people, farmers, sake brewers, wheat growers. These people are allowed to sell their goods every year, encouraged to sell their goods every year outside Tokyo. And this is a very clever move from the Japanese government. The Japanese government heard early on that one of the biggest concerns from these coastal residents was not about their own health or radiation. They were concerned they would not be able to sell their goods at the end of the day, and they would lose money. So since 1980 or so, the central Japanese government has sponsored this annual electricity fair to allow these farmers and fishermen to sell their goods there in Tokyo. That's the first part of the talk. The first part is focused on this question, how has it been the Japanese government has been able to bring people in line with central government plans for a very advanced commercial nuclear power system, given Japan's historical experiences of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I've argued that the Japanese government chose locations for these kind of projects in areas where local citizens would be less likely to fight back, and then offered various incentives and programs to convince them to come on board, to accept these programs, and to not fight against them. The next question for us is, how has civil society, how have these local residents in Tohoku and elsewhere responded to the government since the 3/11 disaster of last year? I'm going to begin with what we're calling a citizen science website. Now, this is just one static image from that website, but if you go to safecast.org, you'll see this is a site created by citizens in Japan, angered by what they saw as the lack of transparency and the lack of openness in the data provided by the central government and by the Tokyo Electric Power Company after the accident in March of 2011. Many local citizens believed they were not getting up-to-date information or accurate information. So citizens decided that they would create their own source for the entire world to see about radiation levels. And if you look closely at this image on the screen, each individual dot is either one or multiple radiation readings. The different colors of those dots indicate different levels of millisieverts of radiation. If you can tell, by the way, the red dots up there are the cities of Iitate and Futaba. Those red and orange dots are the highest levels of measured radiation. But most of the green dots outside that area, in fact, are lower levels of radiation. By the way, Tokyo is the very bottom of this map where the star is located. And what citizens have done in Japan is they've attached Geiger counters and other radiation detectors to the windows of their cars and driven as close as they could get up to Fukushima. And they've uploaded all that data. When I checked yesterday, there are over 1.2 million pieces of data that have been uploaded to this site. And this might be a great place to see, by the way, if you're doing a section on radiation levels, a great place because it's a Google map, which is clickable, and you can, of course, expand the map or contract it. And you can see how radiation on a daily or weekly or a yearly basis has changed. But for citizens in Japan, at least, this has been one response from them to show they're no longer satisfied with the status quo, and they have now begun this process of citizen science, of creating and uploading their own data in a transparent and open framework for everyone to see. And by the way, the government itself now has begun using information from Safecast in better understanding radiation exposure for citizens in towns nearby. There's another type of response we've seen from civil society. If you follow Japanese history back even 30 or 40 years, there have really been only a few sets of large-scale demonstrations against government policies. The first came in the 1960s with the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. The next came in the 1990s when U.S. soldiers in Okinawa attacked a 12-year-old girl there. Since that time, almost 2.5 decades ago, there really have been no large-scale protests on the size of the demonstrations this image is showing, when more than 45,000 people showed up in Tokyo's Yoyogi Park for a large anti-nuclear rally. In Japan, for the past few decades, especially compared to America, for example, the Million Man March here, or broader demonstrations, or Europe, in France, in Poland, in Italy, where demonstrations are much more normal, very few Japanese citizens regularly go, or even occasionally go, to these large-scale protests. But the issue of nuclear power has brought out a new wave of activists and even normal citizens who feel the government is not listening to their voices. So this image is one of a number that I've seen of the large-scale protests that are ongoing in Japan against the nuclear power program there. If this works, I want to take you to a video now. This video is on YouTube, and the URL there is posted at the top. This video is of an interaction between local citizens who live in Fukushima and bureaucrats from the central government who have been sent to tell them about new government plans. Now, in the past, this kind of lecture would have been a very quiet one, because typically these are what we call rituals of assent, meaning that the people, the citizens in the audience, listen to the scientists and the bureaucrats. They often nod their heads and they go home. But as you'll see in 1 second, that was not the response that these bureaucrats got when they lectured on July the 19th of last year. I'm not sure that actually played well or not. I'm sorry if the video was slow. But for me, as a scholar of Japan, the most important message was what in the past would have been a very quiet interaction between bureaucrats and scientists from the central government and local citizens has turned into a public backlash against those kind of messages. Citizens in Fukushima and elsewhere are no longer simply accepting the messages they're hearing from central government bureaucrats, from politicians, from local representatives, and now they're speaking back publicly. And I think we can see this now in changes in public opinion on nuclear power. So if this slide is shown up, you should see roughly 6 measurements that I've taken over time, beginning back in 2005 and 2009, before the disaster. And notice we really have 5 major columns. People who want to increase the use of nuclear power, maintain the status quo, decrease over time, abolish right now, and the final column is unknown. They had no opinion. In 2005 and 2009, before the disaster, roughly 2/3 of all the people polled, and each one of these polls had more than 1,200 people there. So these are large-scale, nationally representative polls. Roughly 2/3 of the respondents wanted to increase the use of nuclear power. If you scan now to the very bottom row, with the most recent data from 2011, only 2% of the respondents in 2011 after the disaster wanted to increase the use of nuclear power. In other words, clearly people are no longer in favor of it. If you now look to the last, second to last columns, the decrease and abolish columns, in 2005 and 2009, the percentages are roughly 14% to decrease over time and roughly 2% to abolish over time. If you scan down to the 2011 data at the very bottom, 42% of the respondents wanted to decrease and 1 in 4 wanted to abolish. In other words, the vast majority of public opinion in Japan has shifted now. It's moved from support, and you definitely saw in the 2005 and 2009 figures support for nuclear power. It's moved away from support and towards an anti-nuclear position. Okay. That was the question of how has civil society responded, and I've argued that we see now citizen science, a bottom-up response. We see angry public denunciations of official proclamations at those meetings like in Fukushima. We see mass rallies like in Tokyo, and we also have seen this kind of shift in public opinion. So now that we're in 2012, roughly 1 year after the disaster, what factors will matter now for Japan's future? How will Japan recover from the disaster? If you read the literature out there, or even newspapers, I think there are really 5 major theories that try to explain what factors matter after disaster. In the upper left-hand corner of this image should be a picture of money. And oftentimes after disaster, the first thing people think matters is aid, getting money in. I remember in Washington State, after Mount St. Helens, the President of America asked the governor of Washington what she wanted, and she said M-O-N-E-Y. And it's the same kind of response we've seen in Hurricane Katrina, and in Japan, oftentimes people argue money is the most important. But the second image in the top, the middle image, shows governance, the quality of our leaders, the quality of our politicians. And the argument is, the better leaders we have, the better we can respond to disaster and prepare for it. In the top right-hand corner is a picture of disaster, damage from the disaster. Economists often argue that the more damage done by like an earthquake or a tsunami, the slower the recovery. So the less damage, like a flood, for example, in a basement, will be much quicker than a large-scale 2-month flooding like in Hurricane Katrina. The bottom left-hand image shows population density. And the argument is that areas like Tohoku in the northeast part of Japan that are very rural have more free space to build new housing and to replace old housing than more populated areas like Tokyo or Manhattan, for example, or Chicago. The bottom right-hand corner shows inequality. This image comes from Brazil. On the left hand of the image are the favelas, the dirt-floored, often aluminum-sided shacks. On the right side of the wall there are condominiums, each of which have their own pool, if you can see the image closely there. So a difference in wealth, Oftentimes people argue it makes a big difference because it's hard to decide whom do you help first. I think these theories give us a few insights into the process of recovery, but they miss a more important approach that we're calling social capital. Social capital is simply the ties that bind us together, the relationships that we have with our friends, with our family, with our networks. And there are really three different types of social capital. Bonding social capital connects people who are quite similar. So maybe it connects you and your parents or you and your friends. It might connect you and your fellow teachers out there, or me and my fellow professors. Bonding social capital connects people who are quite similar. Occasionally, though, we meet people who are different than us outside our typical networks. And we call those connections bridging social capital. A church, a synagogue, a mosque, a sports club, or a school, those are different institutions that can put us in contact with people who are quite different from us. The third and final type of connections would be linking social capital. Occasionally, we have connections to people above us with power, someone in the Red Cross, someone in the mayor's office, someone who can get something done. I want to give now quickly three different mechanisms through which social capital works after disaster. First, the first choice made by every survivor after a disaster is the choice to go back home and rebuild, whatever the costs, or the decision to relocate oneself and one's family. So we call leaving the area exit when you go to build a new life someplace else. But we call staying in the damaged area and rebuilding voice. Voice means that we work with people who are like us, who've come back, and we make our decisions and our interests known to local politicians, local decision makers. We've found in our studies so far of Japan, India, and America that individuals with more social ties, with more social capital, they have more voice. Those who are more fragmented, who have fewer connections to locally, they'll use exit. So it doesn't make a big difference, of course, in the process of trying to rebuild a ghost town or an empty area. The second mechanism of these social ties is overcoming the barriers to collective action. Many of us feel quite strongly about issues, but it's pretty rare we get out there and vote, or we get out there and march, or we write a letter to our congressperson, because we think someone else will do it. Well, after a disaster, there are many issues that require the group to work collectively. If the group doesn't have the strong social ties, it's far less likely they'll get involved in group activities, like, for example, having a patrol in their neighborhood to keep out looters, or working together to pick up garbage from the streets nearby. If they have to wait for the government to do those kind of things, the recovery process will be a lot longer. And we've found in all these countries we're studying that people with more ties get involved in these group activities more often. Finally, deeper social capital means more mutual aid or informal insurance. That is, people who are tied together are likely to let each other borrow tools after a disaster, for cutting out rotting drywall in the basement, or to borrow a place to sleep if your own house has been damaged, or for giving out information if we're not quite sure what's going on. So this process of investing in relationships has nothing to do with money or income. This is about building ties and building connections locally. If you're more deeply connected to your community, you have more informal insurance to draw upon after the disaster. I want to show just quickly now two ways in Japan's history how these kind of social bonds have made a difference in the process of recovery. This chart shows between 1923 and 1933, as World War II ramped up in Japan, the change in population in the capital city of Tokyo. Each of these boxes has an average at the center, that line there. And this is the average over 40 different neighborhoods in Tokyo. All of Tokyo can be divided into 40 neighborhoods. Notice between 1922 and 1923, the first blue box, the average was negative 0.4. It means the average neighborhood lost 40% of their population because of a huge earthquake that struck. Over the next year, the population change swung upward in positive way to 30% upwards. But then for the next decade, the average for these communities was around 0. There are some outliers, though. Some communities had positive growth, as we see from the dots on top above 0, and some had negative growth, as we see from the dots below 0. Why would some communities bring back population and bring in new people, and other communities over time would lose people? Well, we divided those 40 neighborhoods into two buckets, two bins, two types. One type had more social capital, more bonds, and we measured this through their involvement in local events like demonstrations, marches, and voting. Those communities in Tokyo that had higher levels of voting, of turning out to vote together, of demonstrating together, they're on the right side of this image. And the average population growth rate was around 6% in those communities. There is some other variation, but that's the average. In the left-hand column, we see those communities with less social capital. They don't vote as often, they don't get outside their homes as often, they don't march together as often. That area is much closer to 0. And what we've actually done is we've taken into account all the theories we mentioned initially, damage from the disaster, different mayors or governors or prime ministers in Japan. We've kept all that stuff in the background, and controlling for all of those factors, we now have the best predictor of recovery in Tokyo after the 1923 disaster. The best predictor of recovery was voter turnout. How many people got out from their homes, went outside and voted on election days in the 1920s and 30s. In those years, people were much more likely to come back because they had connections to the communities. They felt a part of the place nearby. For those neighborhoods in Tokyo, which unfortunately did not vote as much, didn't get out as much, their population was often quite close to 0. It stayed the same over the decade after the disaster. We also have a little more data from Kobe, which in 1995 had a huge earthquake which killed over 8,000 people. And we simply mapped 2 very small neighborhoods of around 200 people each that we're calling Nagata and Fukushima, the left column and the right column. Notice they're quite similar in many ways. The population is around 200 in both of them. The average age is around the same. The number of households is similar. The income is the same. But notice then for the next few figures, the number of years living in the community, the percentage born there, and the percentage renting, those are quite different. And we know from our research that the longer you live in a community, the more tied in you are. And the more people who own homes, the more of a network you have because they want to protect their investments and know where their neighbors are. So even though these 2 neighborhoods were quite similar in many ways, those differences in social capital meant that the column on the right, the Fukushima B, had a much better recovery after the 1995 earthquake in Kobe than the column on the left, which had lower levels of ties that bind. We also can look after the earthquake in Kobe at the 9 different wards and their population recovery rates. And we can see that certain neighborhoods had a good recovery afterwards. The population went up, and others, the population dropped. In fact, the right column, all of them, the population dropped downwards. Why did some neighborhoods in Kobe do well and recover, and others seem to hemorrhage population over time? Well, again, we can control for all the factors we mentioned before, damage from the earthquake, inequality, income, aid, and so forth. Controlling for all of those factors, the best predictor that we found, at least, in Kobe, was the number of non-profit organizations each neighborhood had formed. If they formed more of these non-profit organizations, if they did more of these collective action activities, the overall population growth rate was much higher. If they didn't get together, if they didn't form these organizations, if they didn't show their connectivity, unfortunately, the recovery was far slower and less effective. Okay, I just want to wrap up now and bring together these 3 different pieces. So the first question that we asked was, how is it that Japan developed this very advanced commercial nuclear power program over the post-war period? And I've argued that it's been a question from the central government of a variety of policy tools, including choosing locations where social capital is weaker, and then offering economic incentives, habituation visits, and these kind of yearly fairs that provide benefits to people living nearby. I then argued that we saw a number of responses from the same civil society, angrily denouncing bureaucratic speak from the top, having large-scale rallies in Tokyo, creating a new website called Safecast for citizen science and measuring radiation levels, and then changing its mind on nuclear power. So right now, in 2012, 1 year later, I believe Japan stands at a crossroads. That is, Japan has the choice now what it will be doing with its nuclear power program, whether or not it will choose to go forward to nuclear power, or like Germany and Italy and Switzerland, choose to phase out either immediately or over time that energy source. Whatever choices Japan is going to make, my argument is civil society will be part of that process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Aldrich. So we now have about 20 minutes for Q&A, so please feel free to enter your questions into the questions box. So to start off, we have educators participating in this webinar, and so what do you think, Professor Aldrich, will be the key takeaway points from your talk for K-12 students?
I think I'd push the students to think, if they've been supporting nuclear power until now, will they continue to support nuclear power even though the costs of stopping it will be so high? That is, if Japan follows Germany's example and turns off its nuclear power plants, citizens might have to double their bills for electricity for the next several decades, or have rolling blackouts over time. What's the cost that people are willing to take to stop the use of nuclear power? I think that's a question that citizens in Japan are thinking about right now, and that we as citizens and followers of Japan should also be thinking about.
Great. Thank you. Again, participants, if you can find the questions box, please, you can directly enter your questions in there. Okay, so we have another question. So you mentioned the importance of sort of the civil society in determining the future of Japan's nuclear power options, but do you think Japan will ultimately phase out nuclear power completely?
Yes, I mean, I think that the long-term goal of most citizens I've talked to over the past year has been to phase out nuclear power. Now, some want to end it right now and not restart the nuclear reactors that are currently idle. Others want to use a decade or two and slowly turn them off and find things like solar, wind, geothermal power to take that space. But I think most citizens that I have talked to, at least, their strong goal is to end Japan's use of nuclear power, either now or over the next decade or two.
Okay, great. Let's see. So as a follow-up question to that, then, if nuclear power no longer becomes a source of energy for Japan, how do you think the country will meet its energy needs while also reducing its dependence on fossil fuels to combat climate change?
This is a very good question, and in fact, I met last week with members of the Federation of Power Companies in Japan here in Washington, D.C., and honestly, there's no good answer right now, either from politicians or from the energy sector. Right now, even if every Japanese citizen and every business reduces their use of electricity, and over the summer of 2013 and the winter, summer 2012 and winter 2013 reduces use by 15%, if there's no nuclear power on at the time, there'll be a gap of around 10% between demand and supply, which means there'll either be rolling blackouts or manufacturing facilities like Toyota, for example, or Mitsubishi, will have to only use their facilities at night when there's more electricity available to them. So this will really mean a huge economic cost. The best possibilities that Japan has in the long term would be things like geothermal, solar, and wind. Those are three sources of carbon dioxide-free power that the Japanese authorities have not pursued since the end of World War II. As I mentioned, a number of different programs that they've created to bring citizens in line with nuclear power. A lot of money has been invested, about $17 million per community, in nuclear power. Almost no money in comparison has been invested in the process of geothermal, in wind, or in solar. If Japan is serious about moving away from nuclear power, it will have to not only import more oil, but also begin investing more in research in these other areas of alternative energy.
Great. Okay, so we now have a question from Kara, and she asks, have you been able to do any research on the social capital networks in the disaster area?
Yes, I am working with a colleague of mine who's at a university there called Ishinomaki Senshu, which is in the area damaged by the quake. I've been there several times myself, and we're doing surveys right now and data collection on people there. And we've noticed several interesting things. The first, as many people might know, is this area was older to begin with. The average age in these communities hit by the tsunami was over 60. which of course makes them quite elderly. And we also know there are very big differences in the way older people make friends and networks versus middle-aged and younger people. Oftentimes, people who are older have friends they've known for a long time who might be neighbors or acquaintances they see every day. The problem with the disaster is it pushed many people out of their normal homes into evacuation shelters, and shelters like school gyms or cultural halls in the city and so forth. So they've lost the normal networks they had before. And we've had a number of people telling us that they feel isolated and alone. They feel lonely. And this is a really big problem because we know after 1995's Kobe earthquake, one of the most preventable problems we saw was what was called the lonely death syndrome in the Japanese media. A number of evacuees from Kobe were placed in safe areas far from the damaged Kobe earthquake area. But they had no friends, and they had no family, and they had no connections nearby. And several hundred of them passed away in their rooms by themselves. So these were called the lonely deaths. So I've been encouraging the Japanese authorities in these areas to think about ways of building up the networks of local survivors. In fact, there was an article, I believe, in today's Wall Street Journal called Knitting a Safety Net, knitting, K-N-I-T. And the joke, it wasn't actually a joke, the joking title meant that a number of older survivors now have joined clubs, like a knitting club, to have time together with people who are also out of a job, they're elderly, they have no friends or family nearby, and they could be quite lonely. So we've noticed that these networks are beginning to reform in new organic ways from their interactions they're having in these evacuation shelters.
Thank you. We have a question from Pona, who asks, kind of going back to what you said about phasing out nuclear power, she asks, I wonder how phasing out nuclear power is really possible given that Japan is still working to recover from a stagnating economy. Would an increase in electric costs make them less competitive in the global market economy and hamper their efforts to improve their economy?
Yes, absolutely. And the front page headlines of the Nikkei Shimbun, of the Japanese equivalent of the Wall Street Journal, has said every single week the last year, if Japan shuts down nuclear power because of civil society, then businesses are threatening to leave Japan and move to areas like China, Indonesia, India, and Vietnam, countries where labor is lower, it's less expensive, and power is more available. A number of businesses have argued that this will reduce Japan's GDP and make them less able to compete if there's not a provision of nuclear power. So it seems the business community is very much against shutting down nuclear power, like Germany is doing, or Switzerland, or Italy, and arguing the costs are far too high for them. And we have no way of knowing exactly what the costs will be, again, because it hasn't happened yet. We do know that if there are rolling blackouts, as there were initially last summer for a few weeks at least, that does cost businesses up to 50% more because they cannot operate the production lines full time. They have to idle the factory and lay off workers. So we know there are absolutely going to be costs associated with this, financial costs and social costs. That is, people will probably lose their jobs, and they might not get them back for a while. So there will be social costs along with economic ones if Japan moves forward in shutting off nuclear power.
Thank you. We have a question from Bob, who asks, how tight is the relationship between the Democratic Party of Japan and the Federation of Power Companies and Energy Bureaucrats?
This is also a great question. So initially, there was a tweet, if you follow Twitter at all, there's a tweet that argued amakudari kills. Amakudari is a Japanese word for descent from heaven. And that's a very fancy way of saying most bureaucrats in Japan and politicians end up very much working in the fields they were connected to in their first civil service or government job. So if I'm a nuclear power bureaucrat or an LDP politician, it's quite likely I've got strong ties to TEPCO and other companies. The DPJ, the new opposition party in Japan, and they're new in the sense that they really haven't been opposition parties until about 2007, they do not have as strong ties to the power companies or to this, what they're calling the nuclear village or the Iron Triangle, that is this very insular network of policymaking on nuclear power issues. So the new opposition party has fewer ties. The funny thing is there haven't been big policy shifts since the DPJ has taken office. The current Prime Minister in Japan, Noda, Prime Minister Khan before this, they've all been members of the opposition party, this DPJ, but they really haven't tried to move Japan as hard away from nuclear power as one might have imagined. So it's an ongoing process the LDP was very much tied into nuclear power. The Socialists and the Democrats, the new opposition parties, they may have fewer ties, but I think they're also cognizant that if they simply cut all connections and refuse to do anything with the power companies, then they'll lack information and perhaps cost their own constituents jobs and money. So my sources in Japan tell me, right now at least, the government is not taking the phone calls of the power companies, but that will probably change in a few weeks, especially as summer approaches and air conditioner use surges.
Thank you. So we have a question from Peter, who asks, there have been reports in the press about the lack of social chaos after the tsunami. Do you think that these reports are accurate, or are they exaggerations?
Yes, I have actually been to Japan. I was there within about 6 weeks of the disaster, and there were lines for toilet paper and for water that stretched over 5 city blocks. No one was pushing or shoving. No one was trying to get around or cutting in line. It was completely organized. And I would argue this is not just a question of Japanese culture per se. The schools in Japan put a lot of effort into socializing children to think of others first. So for example, when we're living in Japan, the schools kids go to in the neighborhood, they have the children serve the school lunch. Then they have them clean up the lunch. They have them wipe the tables. They work together as a group. They stay after school together as a group. There's a lot of work in schools to get children to think about other people. So many citizens that I know, to them the idea of rioting or looting or stealing were just way beyond the pale. Even in the most dire circumstances, that's not going to happen in Japan. People have been socialized by the educational system to be very much part of the group and to think about the needs of other people first. So, I was not surprised that these are not exaggerations, and there were long lines. Now they've died down, but the lines were quite long for those necessities, and no one I saw ever thought about cutting in those lines or trying to cheat.
Thank you. Now, going back to sort of the relationship between the government and the power companies, and so what lessons do you think should the U.S. learn, or the U.S. government learn from what happened in Japan?
It's quite interesting. Just a week or two ago, the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, voted to approve licenses for 2 new nuclear power plants in Georgia. But the vote was not unanimous. It was, I believe, a 4-to-1 vote. And the one vote against giving the license was actually the chairman of the NRC. So the head of the organization itself said out loud, he believed it was too early after Fukushima to be building new nuclear power plants without a more thorough safety review. So, these nuclear power plants in Japan, they were actually built with American plans. These are the GE Mark I reactors. And Michigan and a number of other states in the Midwest still use these exact same type of reactors, which means, in theory at least, if we could recreate the exact tsunami problems, flooding of the batteries and the diesel generators, then the same blackout problem would happen in America. So in other words, we are not immune from the same technological faults that these reactors had. Our reactors are also aging. These reactors in TEPCO were built in 1964. Many of the American reactors also built in the 1960s, and again, the same type of reactor. So a lot of anti-nuclear groups in America have argued that we should really think about idling our reactors until we redesign or at least reinforce these kind of obvious problems, which is having 2 levels of backup is great if they're going to work when the lights go out elsewhere and there's no power to come in from the outside or there's water nearby. So there are broader lessons in safety. I think we're also seeing right now that for a long time in Japan, the civil society had little voice in the decision to use nuclear power. And I'm not sure there's been an open debate in America since 3 Mile Island happened about what Americans want, what costs and benefits we're willing to have. Clearly, some communities in America might be willing to have nuclear power plants despite the risks. Others may not be willing to have those. And the weird thing is there really hasn't been a public discussion. So for me, one of the broader lessons should be, what role is civil society in America going to play in our national energy strategy? Now, I'm from Indiana, Purdue is in West Lafayette, and we had a lot of discussions about the new wind turbines. The 250 tall, these are huge, right? These are roughly 30 stories tall from the blade down to the bottom that were being built in our backyard. And we had open discussions about the possible killing of birds or the possible noises and the vibrations and so forth. So there was an open discussion of the costs and benefits of installing this carbon dioxide-free source, which was wind power. I haven't seen as much these open discussions at the national level in America about the costs and benefits of atomic energy.
Thank you. And we have another question from another participant. And so what do you think is the role of sort of schools in terms of disaster drills, or sort of educating students to be prepared for disasters?
Sure. We used to live in Tokyo. This is our third time. In fact, we're going back in about 4 months as a family. And all the schools in Japan, to my knowledge, have regular disaster drills, just like the schools in the Midwest have tornado drills. And part of the discussion is, what should you do, where do you go? And they drill this repeatedly. They even have a national fire safety day. And my kids and I got to use fire extinguishers outside. We had a whole simulator of an earthquake. Japan takes disaster risk very seriously, and they encourage citizens to be prepared. So they encourage citizens to have a wireless radio, to have water on hand. They want to know safety evacuation routes. Japan takes it seriously. I'm not sure America is quite there yet in terms of broader levels of involvement in this kind of disaster drills. I think schools can be great places to teach those kinds of skills, and for an open discussion as well of what would happen. What do we do? Now, a number of the sadder stories and the happier stories in Tohoku came from schools. A lot of school kids got out because they had the drills. They had worked together as a group and knew where to go. Other schools were hit so quickly they could not get out. So schools in Japan certainly were among the areas hit by the tsunami, and a number of school children were killed. So I think it's really critical that students anywhere, America or Japan, have the kind of training to know what to do, where to go. The other thing to think about, too, is if there's a major disaster in America that's not weather-related, like a nuclear power disaster, what would parents do? Most parents that I know would drive to the school to pick up their kids. That would really make it hard to evacuate effectively if all the parents drove to the school. By the way, if you look back at 3 Mile Island, this is more or less what happened. Even though 3 Mile Island had all kinds of official evacuation routes, a number of parents ignored them and drove to the schools to pick up their kids. So talking with parents as well, students and parents, what do we do if your student is in our classroom and there's a tornado, or there's a nuclear power problem, or there's whatever that happens? Where should you meet your student? Where should you go? New York schools are doing this now with the Indian Point reactor, which is 35 miles north of Manhattan. Other schools, I think, are talking about this as well. How do you involve the parents in a disaster plan in a way that they won't actually damage the process? They won't interfere by trying to drive to school.
Thank you. So related to that, do you know of any resources, either online or print, that you'd recommend for teachers in talking about disasters in their classrooms?
It's a really interesting question. I've seen a few things put out by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, that are geared towards school-age children and below. They actually have a website called, I think, Are You Prepared, I believe. I can double check that later. But FEMA has a number of websites geared toward children, and they have their sort of coloring pages for kids who are younger, more sophisticated stuff for older kids, and for teachers as well. An open discussion again about what a family needs to do. Is there a fire evacuation route from the home? Are there batteries in the smoke detectors and so forth? So I think FEMA actually has a number of different publications geared toward children. The extension schools also, Purdue University's extension school, has on its website a number of discussions about agricultural disasters, flooding, and so forth. And again, some of those materials are aimed at children and school-age children at least.
Thank you. We have another question from a participant. So going back to the social capital, what do levels of social capital in U.S. cities say about how well we might react to a natural disaster?
Wow, this is a really great question and a very long answer, but I'll shorten it down. So I've got a book coming out in August of this year called Building Resilience. And what we did in America and in Japan and India is city by city we traced at the local neighborhood level different levels of social capital. And the interesting finding for us was that there's no way of talking about a city recovering from a disaster, whether it's New Orleans or Manhattan after 9/11 or Tohoku after 3/11. There's no way of discussing an entire region or a city. Disaster recovery is neighborhood by neighborhood, house by house. And what you find is certain neighborhoods in America that you think might be really poor in terms of social capital are really quite strong. And other neighborhoods that are quite wealthy actually have very little social capital. And this interesting finding we had, very wealthy neighborhoods in America, people tend to live in large homes with a long garage, set back from the street, no porch, and they often use a garage door opener to say hello to their neighbors, right? They drive in and close the door. Poor communities in America often are closer to the street. There are porches where neighbors can sit together and talk. They don't have a garage parking, and they park on the street. Those small physical factors make a big difference in building bonds to our neighbors. So what we actually found was even very poor neighborhoods in New Orleans had very high levels of social capital. They knew their neighbors' names. They knew if they needed a wheelchair or a diabetes medicine. That kind of information wasn't available to a lot of very wealthy neighborhoods. So we found a very strong variation, even in the same city of New Orleans or in Manhattan or in Tokyo or elsewhere, depending on what had been there before. What are the physical characteristics there? How long have people lived there? Have they been neighbors for a long time? Are they more active or not? And some neighborhoods simply seem to be more active. They have more outdoor parties. They have more block parties. They have more sales publicly. Those are all activities that build connections. If you meet your neighbors at a party outside, if there's a yard sale nearby. So we found very strong variation across cities. So there's no one easy way to characterize America. Compared to other industrialized nations, we do have pretty good levels of social capital as a whole. But again, that varies widely within each city.
Thank you. So we now have about a minute left. So Professor Aldrich, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Absolutely. You know, it's funny. At the end of the day, we are the first responders after disasters, whether in Japan or in America. The likelihood is if there's a problem, it's going to be we and our neighbors who dig ourselves out. That was the case in Kobe. In Tohoku, the people who saved their neighbors from the tsunami were neighbors. So, you know, I would definitely encourage students and teachers both to think about what are we doing in our lives to build up those connections through churches, synagogues, through mosques. Are we getting involved in local sports activities? Are we involved in our community neighbors? I often ask my students how many neighbors they can name in their dorms. It's a pretty small number of college students who can name their neighbors. It's kind of embarrassing, actually. Even my colleagues who live nearby maybe know a few neighbors. So I would say the biggest lesson for me as a survivor of Katrina and a scholar now in disaster recovery is to encourage people to get to know their neighbors and to build up those social capital bonds.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Aldrich, for sharing your expertise with us today. Your presentation definitely deepened our understanding of Japanese people's attitudes toward nuclear power and future implications. So to wrap up the webinar then, I wanted to share with you a few resources. So if you're interested in learning how to teach students about the earthquake, tsunami, and the nuclear energy situation and their long-term implications and consequences, we recently submitted a post to the New York Times Learning Network blog that describes a variety of ways to include a number of different primary sources in your teaching. The post will be published on March 9th, so please be on the lookout for that. Also, if you're interested in learning more about the nuclear energy situation or what's happened over the past year, please refer to these links here. And we'll also be sending a follow-up email to you containing more links. So thank you all again for your participation. And now I'm going to turn things over to Maggie, who will share with you a few of the upcoming events and programs at Primary Source.
Thanks so much, Lena, and thanks everyone for joining us for today's webinar. Before we go, I want to let you know, as Lena said, about a few upcoming programs at Primary Source. Registration for our Summer Institutes is now open. We want to invite you to join us here in Boston for face-to-face Summer Institute or online for an online course. We have 2 courses about China. Information about all our summer offerings is available at www.primarysource.org/summerinstitutes. We also have 2 more webinars about Japan coming up this spring. The next webinar will take place on March 27th, and that will deal with aspects of Japanese culture. And the final webinar of the spring will be on April 12th. In this webinar, you'll learn more about all of our online resources to support the teaching of Japan, and you'll get a sneak preview of our upcoming online course about Japan. So register for those by going to primarysource.org/teachingaboutjapan webinars, or it's on our homepage also if you just go to primarysource.org. On behalf of everyone here at Primary Source, I want to thank you for spending this Monday afternoon with us. Look out for an email in the coming week. It'll have a link to the recording of the webinar, a link to the slides that Professor Aldrich shared, and also all of those links that Lena mentioned, including a few more. So check out that email. When you exit the webinar today, a 3-question survey should open up. We really appreciate your feedback on this webinar so that we can improve our future webinars. And it's just 3 questions, so thank you for filling that out. We invite you to stay in touch with us on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on YouTube, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thanks so much.